If you like my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I post extra in-depth bonus videos, such as the dedicated episode on the Carthaginians or Etruscan metallurgy. More content and biblical translation will be also found on Patreon, link in the description. Hello, noble ones, and welcome to the third episode of my series dedicated to the literal translation of the biblical text. On the first two episodes, we have talked about how angels and demons are actually described in the text according to a more accurate and faithful translation from ancient Hebrew. Today, we will look at the story of the creation of the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. As it is always the case for each episode in this series, I'd like to remind my audience that this is not a doctrinal or doctrinal approach, it's more of a secular, linguistic one. If you are a person of faith, then absolutely use these videos to add to your understanding of scripture. If you are an atheist or you simply belong to a different religion, you're still more than welcome here because this can be a great deep dive into a more cultural, linguistic, and accurate approach into the interpretation of ancient texts. We have got a lot of ground to cover, but the first thing I'd like to talk about is the famous/infamous forbidden fruit, namely the apple. In a moment we'll be reading a couple of verses that have to do with the forbidden fruit, and I'll tell you what's actually written on the text. But I'd like to say that I think anyone, regardless of whether you're religious or not, has this idea about this story whereby the serpent is tempting Eve and asks her to partake of the apple of the forbidden fruit. She takes the apple, she eats it, and then she gives it to Adam. Well, the apple is not there. There is no apple in the Bible. Let's read. And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. So according to the biblical text, the only thing we are told is that it's a fruit, generally speaking accepted to be of some sort of round shape. That's all. We don't know how big it was, we don't know what type of fruit it was, we don't even know if within the context of the story it was meant to be a fruit that existed at the time but doesn't exist anymore, or whether it's a fruit that is somewhat similar to something that we could be partaking of today. No information is given, no apple is mentioned. So where does the apple come from then? There are two theories, I'll review both. The first one is polysemic in nature, and it has to do with the translation in Latin of the Hebrew text. And you might have heard this one if you already knew that there is no apple in the Bible, in the sense that the explanation tells us that when the text was translated into Latin and they needed to come up with a fruit, they thought that the apple would have been the perfect representation because in Latin, being a polysemic language, the word malum, which translates into apple, also means evil, and therefore it becomes a sort of, let's say, play on words, which were connected to the fact that we're talking about the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, even though I do need to talk about that tree, and will do very soon. Now, this is a very intriguing explanation, but there are a couple of things I have to say. I looked into it, and I'm not so convinced. First and foremost, yes, the word malum in Latin does mean both apple and evil, but they are not pronounced the same. You see, Latin is a language that utilizes phonemic vowel length, in the sense that the length you give to a specific vowel within a word that is otherwise spelled the same will have a distinguishing factor. At a semantic level, in layman's terms, the word for evil has a short a, malum. The word for apple has a long a, malum. Given they could have still chosen to go that way because they're still quite similar, and so it was kind of a smart translation, if you will, an interesting adaptation, but it is a detail that I think needed to be brought forth, since I noticed that every website that talks about this doesn't mention this. They are not pronounced the same. Secondly, there is no evidence about it. No translator who actually translated the Bible into Latin mentions this choice. And if we try to go back into at least an artistic representation of the idea of when, in medieval art, do we start seeing the actual representation of the forbidden fruit as an apple, it's about 12th century, that's as far back as I could go. And the first translation of the Bible in Latin is much older than that. So it's an intriguing possibility. Maybe that's where the apples come from. but we don't know. But since we're diving into Latin, the second possibility has to do with another word, and it's the word pomum, from Proto-Italic pomos. Now this Latin word eventually will gain the meaning of apple, but originally didn't have it. It just meant a fruit. And in the Proto-Italic original word, it just meant to pick something up, like to forage. So it's possible that the earliest translation used this word as an indicator to just mean fruit, and then as the meaning of the word changed and it acquired a more specific meaning, namely apple, it just automatically carried over into it. Whatever the case, we don't know where the apple specifically comes from, but we do know that it is not present in the original story. To end this point, I'd like to underline that apples in our society do have a strange tendency to be very well accepted by the general public, which could also be one of the reasons why it was sort of a natural occurrence that people just fixated on the apple even in the biblical story. I mean, think about it. An apple is used against Snow White by the witch. It is present in our proverbs. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. One of the biggest and most popular companies out there is called Apple. And the list goes on. Adam, or should I say, the Adam, since in the original language, the name is preceded by the article very often in the text. I'll get back to why I think the article thing is already an indicator of what the actual word means originally, but before we jump into that, I'd like to underline one thing. Oftentimes when we think of how Adam was created, we imagine that Adam was in fact created by God in the Garden of Eden. But as you examine the text more literally, you'll notice that this already likely did not happen that way. Check this out. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So the first information that we gather here is that Adam, a fully formed Adam, was placed in the garden which was in Eden. So Adam was created somewhere else, and then he was placed into the garden. And on that note of linguistic precision, I did use just now the word created when referring to Adam, but I don't believe that that is the most appropriate word when it comes to the good translation of the original word or verb that is used when we are talking about how Adam was created. Linguistically speaking, Adam wasn't created. They do not use the word bara when talking about Adam. So what did they use? Biblically speaking, Adam was formed, he was made, and to me the best translation of this Hebrew word is molded. Adam was molded. This is an important detail because oftentimes, at least in Western thought, not necessarily in biblical Hebrew and in connection with the word bara, but in Western thought, when you use the word create, you tend to imagine something is created from nothing. That is not the case. The Hebrew word is molded, meaning that something that already pre-existed as a raw material was used to then make Adam. And since we're on that note, the Bible uses a completely different word when it's describing how Eve was created. We'll get to that as soon as we jump into the Eve section. But what did I mean when I said that the fact that there is the article right in front of the word Adam could be in fact an indicator? Adam, in my opinion, is a word that represents a species. The Adam doesn't just represent one individual. Usually we express it to be the first. I'm still okay with that idea, but the first of a specific and, mind you, extraordinary species that was made. And in connection to the story, a species that we belong to. So we discussed Adam and the way he was created. What about Eve? Well, the word that is used to represent how Eve was formed is this word in Hebrew that should be translated as constructed or built. Interestingly enough, the word has also some connection to another word in Hebrew, this word here, which means intelligence. And personally, I don't think that that's random. I do think that maybe it does represent one of the probably most important characteristics of Eve, her intelligence. But that's just a speculative idea, I can't really back it up. But I think you're all familiar with how the story goes. Adam is alone, God decides that he needs company, he takes a rib from Adam and makes Eve through the rib. Well, here is another eye-opener here. There is no rib in the Bible. We are now stepping into a more controversial and highly debated aspect of this discussion. Remember, we're just approaching it linguistically. You're still free to believe whatever you want. And if you think that the things I'm presenting to you today sound a bit too out there, well, remember, I'm just presenting opinions from many different people, scholars, linguists, so that you have all information on the table. You choose the one you believe is the most likely, or the one that connects with the information that you already have. What do I mean when I say that there is no rib? In the sense that the original word used in the biblical text does not say rib. It just says a lateral curved part taken from the body of Adam, or Adam's body. So it's on the side, it's lateral, and it's curved. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind as you're trying to navigate through the possible interpretations and translations and all the variables, yeah, of course, you're gonna think, well, yeah, it's on the side, it's curved, the rib. But that's not the only option. And believe it or not, it might not be the most likely. I would like for you to entertain the possibility that perhaps part of the body that was used to build Eve was the iliac crest instead. For a translation to be faithful, it is imperative to first of all make it clear when something is of an interpretative nature. It does not say rib, it is a choice made by a translator, which means that there are an array of other possible choices that could be used and are equally as possible. For instance, the one I just presented to you. The crest of the ilium, or the iliac crest, is the superior border of the wing of ilium, and it's the so-called superior lateral margin of the greater pelvis. The iliac crest stretches posteriorly to the posterior superior iliac spine. One of the characteristics of the iliac crest is that it has a large supply of bone marrow, and it is an area, even in modern medicine, that can be tapped when there is a need for a bone marrow biopsy. Now, why do I think that the iliac crest makes more sense than the rib in this translation? Well, let me tell you about Adam's deep sleep. This is indeed one of the details that fascinates me the most when it comes to this biblical story. A detail that perhaps you have heard, read, mentioned, listened to plenty of times but never really stopped to focus. I know I didn't the first time I heard it. Adam's deep sleep. It is of course easy to just dust it all off and say, well, it's just a symbolic story, we don't have to focus on the details, but as a translator, I'm trying to give weight to the words that were chosen by the original authors to try and think that perhaps that's what they're trying to tell us. And this is really the fabric of my work. Words. God's approach to the fabrication of both man and woman is very physical. We're not talking about something that he does this, uses magic, and things just appear. As we read the story, we see that not only Adam is used as a subject to harvest something from his body, we'll see what in a second, to make Eve out of that physical something, but the whole story absolutely looks like a surgical procedure. Now really think about it. Adam goes into a deep sleep, his body is opened on his side, so an incision is made, something from his body is taken, the incision is closed, Adam wakes up, finds Eve. It is in fact very similar to the so-called protocol that we employ in modern medicine when it comes to cloning. A deep sleep, anesthesia, an incision on a lateral side of the body. Interestingly enough, bone marrow obtained by the iliac crest aspiration is a common source for harvesting mesenchymical stem cells, other progenitor cells, used specifically in cloning. And then the woman is made. Just a very interesting thought that some linguists brought up, both in the Jewish and Italian translator community. Continuing our journey. Another interesting detail that is often overlooked is how Adam reacts to Eve when she's presented to him. Hear these words. And the lateral curved part of the body, which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. First, the sentence doesn't sound logical in English, but it sounds perfectly logical in the original language. I will call her woman because she comes from a man doesn't have the same effect. But in Hebrew, this is the word for man, this is the word for woman. Literally, is the exact same word with the attached suffix that turns into a feminine word. And sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly, but it's ish becomes isha or isha. So even linguistically, the sentence makes absolute sense in Hebrew. There is a connection at an etymological level. But let's go back a little bit. Look at the very beginning of the sentence. What would you think if I told you this? Oh, this time you got me the right game. This is the one I want. What does that make you think? That there were other games that were presented to me before, but they weren't the right ones. One might need to read this in between the lines, but this is what it seems to be bringing up as an option. What this connects to is something that I talked about on my dedicated video to demons and the entity called Lilith. You'll find a link in the description. Another word that I'd like to discuss when it comes to Old Testament lexicon and how it can connect to sort of a more faithful, direct and somewhat physical translation or interpretation of the old text is the word tselem. Once again, if I'm mispronouncing it, I apologize profusely. And this is once again one of those words that could be considered to be polysemic and might change their translation and meaning depending on the context in which we find them. Another one of these is the word ruach, which can be translated as spirit, but it can also be translated as wind. And the parts where I think should be translated as wind render the verses much more fascinating, as I mentioned on my video dedicated to angels. Tselem, when it comes to this, is the word that normally translates as image, and it's the one that is used, for example, when God, during the creation, tells us that mankind, men and women, are made in his image. Now, image is interesting because it doesn't only have, in the biblical text and in biblical Hebrew, an abstract connotation. So, an image, something that looks like it. But the same word is used also to talk about statues or even facial expressions. So something that is actually physical. And sometimes you do find it translated as statue, even though the word is still tselem. It's an image. Some biblical translators in Italy, such as Mauro Biglino, a person that I extremely respect, even though I don't always agree with. There are plenty of things that I disagree with, but he's an excellent translator. One of the things he proposes is that perhaps tselem should be translated as that something that contains the image. And I find this to be a very intriguing possibility. And of course, he then kind of proceeds to connect to the possibility of a surgical procedure when it comes to the creation of Eve, because he thinks then what within a human being contains an image, and a possible discussion would be DNA. I find that fascinating, but it's a little bit extra textual, so I'll just present it to you as something that could be interesting to think about as we continue our journey. And we now reach the garden. The Hebrew word to translate the Garden of Eden is Gan Eden. Interestingly enough, G-A-N, so the Gan part of this word, is the one that is normally translated as garden. In fact, a good translation could be a garden that is fenced and protected, an area that is in fact isolated and separated physically from the rest or the surrounding land. Eden is instead the place where the garden is placed. Eden or Eden is the place's location. Now, where this place could be in the world is definitely something we will explore today as we continue into this section. But first I want to describe to you what this garden looked like and what were some of the characteristics that make the vegetation in this garden particularly, shall we say, special. And the river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The rivers that are described in the following passages are in fact one of the best hints that we can try and use as we explore the possible geolocation of the Garden of Eden. But before we jump into that, we understand that the garden was irrigated through river water. As we read, we are then told that there are several types of trees in the garden, but they are generally speaking divided into 2 possible varieties. The trees that have a decorative purpose, chosen because they are pretty, and the trees that are instead used as a source of food. But the most important aspect of the garden is its core, the center. As we read the first description of the center of the garden, we see that the characteristic, the special aspect, is the fact that it contains one of the 2 special trees within this garden, the tree of life. But what does the original language actually say? It is the tree of the lives, or maybe, as an alternative interpretation, the tree of the living. Choose either, they're both valid. The book tells us that any being who eats or partakes from this fruit basically becomes immortal and can live forever. But the tree that is really central to our story is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Evil in this case being translated from the word ra, or ra, with a more modern Hebrew pronunciation, which does translate evil, but not exactly in the sense that you might think. In biblical Hebrew, ra can be considered very broad in a sense. It can mean evil, can mean bad, something malignant, but also something unpleasant that can happen to you, something displeasing. So it could refer to something morally evil, but it could also refer to something tangible, such as an adversity or a form of distress, injury or wrong. It can be ethical, it can also be more concrete. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Already there is quite a lot of discussion between linguists as whether this "and," when the two special trees that are forbidden are mentioned, whether that "and" means that there is the tree of the lives or the living in the middle, and then there is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil somewhere else in the garden. Eve, however, tells us as we continue to read that the tree is also in the middle. So my personal interpretation, this is for example one of the things that we disagree on with Mauro Biglino, is that both trees were in the middle. I do tend to trust Eve since she was, well, an eyewitness, so a primary source. I think both trees are in the middle, maybe right next to each other. So having said all this, does the text tell us where the Garden of Eden was? Well, there isn't a precise indication, which is why this is once again one of those aspects that you have lots of different, not only religious people, but also academics who are literally studying the text, even if they study it at a secular level, just as a text written in the Bronze Age in a specific geolocation. As they are trying to figure out where the Garden of Eden is, they are generally speaking using the description of the rivers that I was mentioning before. And different religious figures over the centuries have given us different ideas, with people thinking that it's somewhere in the Middle East, some people even speculating that it could be somewhere in Africa, and some people like Joseph Smith who said instead it was in America. So just by looking at these rivers, I think it is possible that the original location of this garden would have been somewhere near the ancient Mesopotamia, probably not too far from, geographically speaking, what we call Armenia. However, the more I read the story, and the more I read also extra biblical sources, which I won't bring in today since we're mostly focusing on this script, but my personal opinion is that story-wise, considering also the stories that predate the biblical aspect of a few thousand years, such as in the Sumero-Akkadic descriptions of the creation of man, Adam and Eve, all stories that absolutely predate the biblical account, it is my opinion that there were multiple gardens such as these, and that they weren't just gardens for the sake of it. The garden part is just the way that they produced food, but most likely there were some sort of strategic command centers placed in specific areas because of the natural resources surrounding it, which is something that we are told anyways, or given a hint of in the text. But that's just me. As a final thought, I'd like to sort of focus on this statement that Adam and Eve are the first humans. This is another statement that I slightly disagree with, particularly when looking at the faithful translation of the text. Once again, I mean no offense if this is your personal belief or the belief of your religion. I respect that, so I hope you will respect my freedom to disagree. Let's talk about Cain. As we know, Adam and Eve wasn't exactly the happiest family after the fall. Adam and Eve have a child, Cain. They have another child, Abel, and then eventually they will have Seth. But Cain kills Abel. He's confronted by God and he's cast out. What does Cain tell God when he learns of his punishment? And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Right. But if there was no one else on the earth, who is he afraid of? What is he talking about? Who is going to slay him the moment he steps out? Moreover, as the curse at least has somewhat of a protection level, we know that another interesting figure or character in the story is brought forth, Cain's wife. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she was conceived, and bare Enoch. We're not told anything about Cain's wife. Some people speculate that it must have been one of his sisters. Generally speaking, the people that believe that is the people that think that only Adam and Eve and then their children were the only humans that existed, which would naturally result into incest for the first families. But other people think that it's possible that instead he went out and there were other people and he found his wife there. The Bible doesn't tell us. No matter what people will tell you, they will tell you, no, but it must mean, and yeah, but the text is still not telling you that. Therefore, when you say that it was Cain's sister, that's your interpretation, but it's not black and white. The way I see this, as I read the story literally, is that Adam and Eve were the first Adamites, the first members of this different, extraordinary species that we belong to, but there were other humans who weren't Adamites and weren't as sophisticated as the Adamites. They were more barbaric, if you will, which would explain also why Cain was kind of, if you send me among those guys, they're gonna slit my throat. And they already inhabited the earth, but Adam is a special species, our species. But, of course, this is just an interpretation of a Bronze Age book that I personally like very much reading and studying. Please let me know what you think. I hope that you enjoyed this. And the next episode is going to be amazing. So stay tuned, subscribe, become a noble one for more content from the Metatron. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.